I could objectively say that this is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. And nothing less than a maximum sentence would be appropriate, and anything less than the maximum sentence would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. Deputies, I would respectfully ask that you take this defendant into custody and have him serve the rest of his life in the Department of Corrections. We are in recess.
Chris Watts was not a monster you could recognize at first glance. He did not look dangerous. He did not sound unstable. He did not raise his voice or lose control in public. He smiled softly, spoke politely, and presented himself as a devoted husband and a loving father. That is what made him so terrifying. Behind the calm eyes and measured words lived a man capable of erasing his entire family without hesitation. A man who could destroy 4 lives and then stand in front of a camera, asking for their safe return, knowing they would never come back. From the outside, Chris Watts appeared to be the image of quiet suburban stability. A steady job, a modest home in a newly built Colorado neighborhood, a wife who shared family photos online, documenting birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments. 2 young daughters who laughed, played, and trusted their father completely. Nothing about their...
Hi, guys. Say
What's
hi,
going
Bella.
on?
We gotta get you dressed, kid.
I
Look
know,
what Bella's
right?
eating. Bella's eating some of the ingredients.
She got a nice little bowl of chocolate chips.
Look at that. What is that, Bella? Can you show them? What is it? Is it chocolate?
Is it chocolate?
It's chocolate mini morsels, right? Yeah, good job. So she's been eating my peanut butter and the chocolate morsels so far today. So we're gonna let a few more people hop on, and then we're gonna get cooking here, and we'll explain to you what we're cooking up over here. So
Yeah, welcome to the 12 days of Christmas, Lavelle Day, and even though I like to claim that I could probably cook, I can't at all. So I'm gonna let my wife do all the cooking. She's gonna make up some Thrive Bites for us.
and I'm gonna go wash my hands real fast.
Uh-oh. She's gonna leave me here alone. Oh, we got some people joining. Bella, look. Got people looking at us. Say hi. Wife's gonna be making up some Thrive Bites here in a second, so make sure you hop on and join us for the 12 days of Christmas. Bella's got some chocolate chips.
Nothing about their life suggested violence. Nothing hinted at the darkness that was slowly taking shape behind closed doors. But evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind routine. Sometimes it wears the face of normalcy. And sometimes it grows silently inside a man who feels trapped by his own choices. Chris Watts did not wake up one morning and decide to become a killer. What happened in August of 2018 was not a sudden explosion of rage. It was the final act of a long internal collapse. A collapse fueled by resentment, selfishness, lies, and the desperate desire to escape responsibility at any cost. To understand how Chris Watts became a family annihilator, you have to look beyond the crime scene. You have to examine the psychology of a man who felt invisible, controlled, and increasingly detached from the life he helped create. A man who chose erasure over honesty, silence over accountability, murder over divorce, Chris Watts was a man who learned how to disappear long before he learned how to kill. He disappeared into routines, into silence, into the expectations of others. He learned how to say the right things without feeling them, how to nod without agreeing, how to live a life that looked complete while feeling nothing inside. That emptiness would eventually become lethal. To anyone watching from the outside, the Watts family looked like a model of suburban success. A neat house in a quiet Colorado neighborhood, a stable job, 2 young daughters with bright smiles and matching outfits, a 3rd child on the way. Social media was filled with proof that this was a happy family. Smiling photos, videos of birthdays and holidays, posts about love, teamwork, and gratitude. Chris appeared in these moments as a supportive husband and an engaged father, always calm, always compliant. But behind the curated image was a marriage strained by imbalance and unspoken resentment. Shanann Watts was strong-willed, outspoken, and dominant in the relationship. She made decisions. She organized their lives. She spoke for both of them. Chris rarely pushed back. He rarely expressed disagreement. Instead, he internalized every frustration, every slight, every moment where he felt controlled or diminished. He did not argue. He absorbed. Over time, absorption turned into emotional withdrawal. Chris stopped connecting. He stopped empathizing. He stopped seeing his family as individuals with needs and emotions. They became symbols of obligation. Wait. Barriers between him and a different life he quietly began to imagine. That imagined life did not include children. It did not include debt. It did not include responsibility. It was simple, selfish, and free. And when Chris Watts discovered an affair, that fantasy solidified into something tangible. With another woman, he felt admired without effort, desired without pressure, unburdened by expectations. It was not love. It was escape. As the affair deepened, Chris's detachment from his family became more pronounced. He grew colder, more distant. Shanann noticed the shift. Messages between them revealed tension, confusion, and fear. She sensed that something was wrong, but she did not yet understand how far gone her husband truly was. She believed their marriage could be fixed. She believed in communication, in counseling, in fighting for family. Chris believed in disappearance. Divorce would have required confrontation. It would have required him to admit failure, to face financial consequences, to lose control of the narrative. Chris Watts did not want to be seen as the bad guy. He wanted a clean break without mess, without explanation, without accountability. In his distorted thinking, murder offered that solution. The decision was not impulsive. It was calculated. Chris thought through logistics, timing, disposal. He reduced human lives to problems that needed to be solved. This is what made him especially dangerous. He was not driven by rage in the moment. He was driven by cold, self-centered logic stripped of empathy. In the early hours of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home from a business trip. She was exhausted, pregnant, vulnerable. She went to bed believing she would wake up to another day of conflict, uncertainty, and attempts to save her marriage. She never woke up. What happened in that house remains one of the most chilling examples of domestic annihilation in modern true crime. Chris Watts murdered his wife, then turned his attention to his children. Bella and Celeste trusted him completely. They followed him. They did not resist. They did not understand. The betrayal was total. Afterward, Chris Watts did something even more disturbing. He calmly loaded the bodies into his vehicle. He drove to his work site. He disposed of them with mechanical precision. Then he went about his day. By the time authorities became involved, Chris had already rehearsed his performance. He played the role of the devastated husband flawlessly. He spoke softly. He expressed concern. He appealed to the public for help. He stood in front of cameras and asked for the safe return of his family, knowing exactly where they were and what he had done. The performance might have worked if not for its emptiness. His words lacked urgency. His emotions felt disconnected. Investigators noticed the absence of genuine panic. Friends noticed inconsistencies. And under pressure, Chris Watts began to unravel. Confronted with evidence, he shifted stories. First denial, then partial admission, then blame. He attempted to paint himself as a man who snapped as someone pushed beyond limits. But the facts told a different story. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of convenience. The truth, once fully revealed, shocked the world. A man who appeared harmless had erased his entire family to pursue a fantasy that never existed. There was no freedom waiting for him, no new life, only a prison cell and the irreversible knowledge of what he had done. Chris Watts is not frightening because he was unique. He is frightening because he was ordinary, because he hid in plain sight, because he demonstrated how emotional cowardice, unchecked resentment, and profound selfishness can culminate in absolute destruction. This case remains a reminder that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like fathers. Sometimes they smile for cameras. And sometimes, by the time the truth is visible, it is already too late. After the initial cracks appeared, the entire structure of Chris Watts's carefully constructed persona began to collapse. Investigators did not see a grieving husband. They saw a man performing grief, repeating phrases that sounded learned rather than felt. His body language betrayed him. The lack of urgency, the absence of genuine fear. The way he spoke about his missing family as if they were already gone. It was subtle, but it was there. As the investigation deepened, the illusion of innocence became harder to maintain. Phone records revealed emotional distance and secrecy. Messages showed detachment rather than concern. Financial stress emerged as a constant pressure in the background of their lives. Debt had accumulated. Expectations had piled up. For Chris, every obligation felt like another wall closing in. Shanann Watts had sensed the emotional withdrawal long before her death. She had tried to reconnect. She asked questions. She searched for reassurance. Her messages showed vulnerability and confusion. She wanted answers. She wanted honesty. She wanted to believe that the man she married still existed. But by that point, Chris was no longer capable of offering truth without destroying the fantasy he was clinging to. What made the situation even more disturbing was how normal everything appeared in the days leading up to the murders. There were no dramatic arguments witnessed by neighbors, no public confrontations, no obvious warning signs. Chris Watts continued going to work. He continued interacting with others. He continued pretending. This emotional compartmentalization allowed him to function while preparing to commit irreversible acts. When Shanann confronted him emotionally, he did not respond with anger. He responded with emptiness. He had already made his decision. In his mind, the future had been rewritten. The people standing in his way had been reduced to obstacles rather than human beings. This cognitive shift is critical in understanding how such crimes occur. Empathy is not lost suddenly. It erodes gradually. The murders themselves were not chaotic. They were quiet, controlled, calculated. Chris Watts acted with chilling calm as though completing a task rather than ending lives. The children trusted him. That trust was exploited without hesitation. There was no struggle in his narrative because he did not see them as individuals in that moment. He saw them as extensions of a life he wanted erased. Afterward, he cleaned, he planned, he drove, he disposed, and then he returned to normalcy with disturbing ease. He answered messages. He went to work. He spoke to coworkers. The separation between his actions and his demeanor was nearly complete. This dissociation is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Once law enforcement pressure intensified, cracks in Chris Watts's story multiplied. His explanations shifted. His timeline faltered. He attempted to adjust reality to fit the version of events he thought investigators wanted to hear. When confronted directly, he tried to minimize his responsibility. He tried to reframe himself as reactive rather than deliberate. But the evidence did not support that narrative. Eventually, the truth surfaced in full. Not through remorse, but through inevitability. Chris Watts confessed when denial no longer served him. His admissions revealed not a man consumed by guilt, but a man resigned to consequence. His words lacked emotional depth. He spoke of murder with a detached tone, as if describing events that happened to someone else. In the aftermath, the public struggled to comprehend how such a crime could occur without warning. Friends replayed memories. Viewers rewatched videos. Analysts dissected body language and speech patterns. Everyone searched for signs that might have been missed, but the truth was uncomfortable. There were no obvious signs because Chris Watts perfected invisibility. The legacy of this case is not just tragedy, but caution. It exposes the danger of emotional repression, the risk of valuing appearance over authenticity, the consequences of avoiding conflict at all costs. Chris Watts did not explode because he argued too much. He imploded because he never argued at all. Today, he remains confined, physically restrained but mentally unchanged. There is no redemption in his story, no lesson that offers comfort. Only the reality that sometimes the most devastating threats come from those who seem least capable of harm. The Watts case endures because it forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human psychology, about how ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary darkness, about how silence can be more dangerous than anger, and about how the refusal to face responsibility can lead to irreversible destruction. The more investigators examined Chris Watts's behavior, the clearer it became that the murders were not the end of his deception, but its culmination. Long before August 13, he had been lying quietly, not just to others, but to himself. He lied about his unhappiness. He lied about his desires. He lied about his capacity for violence. Each lie allowed the next one to grow larger, heavier, more dangerous. In the days following the disappearance, Chris attempted to control the narrative with the same passivity he had used throughout his life. He answered questions politely. He agreed to searches. He consented to interviews. He believed cooperation would shield him, that appearing helpful would preserve the illusion of innocence. But cooperation without emotion only deepened suspicion. He spoke as though distance already separated him from his family, as though grief was theoretical rather than personal. What unsettled those around him most was not what he said, but what he did not say. There was no desperation in his voice, no raw panic, no uncontrollable fear. He did not behave like a man whose entire world had vanished overnight. He behaved like a man waiting for an inconvenience to resolve itself. As evidence accumulated, it painted a picture of methodical detachment. Digital footprints exposed his emotional withdrawal. Messages showed a man far more invested in preserving his secret life than in recovering his family. His focus drifted not toward hope, but toward logistics, toward timelines, toward managing perception. When confronted with undeniable facts, Chris Watts did not collapse into remorse. He adjusted. He attempted to shift blame, to reshape reality into a version that softened his role. He suggested provocation. He implied emotional strain. He searched for any narrative that would reduce his responsibility while still allowing him to appear human. But each revision only reinforced the truth. This was not an accident. It was not a moment of madness. It was the outcome of deliberate choices made over time. The public response to the full revelation was immediate and visceral. Shock turned into anger. Confusion turned into horror. The idea that a father could murder his own children not in a fit of rage, but in pursuit of personal freedom, challenged fundamental assumptions about family and trust. People searched for motives that made sense, but there was no motive that justified what he did, only selfishness stripped of restraint. Shanann Watts's final days became a focal point of grief. Her messages revealed fear, hope, and determination. She wanted to save her marriage. She wanted stability for her children. She believed in confronting problems rather than escaping them. In the end, that belief placed her directly in the path of someone who had already chosen escape over honesty. Bella and Celeste became symbols of innocence betrayed. Their images, their voices in videos, their trust in their father haunted the public consciousness. They did not know they were in danger. They had no reason to fear the man who tucked them in at night. That betrayal remains one of the most unbearable elements of the case. As the legal process concluded, there was no dramatic reckoning. No emotional breakdown. Chris Watts accepted his sentence with the same emotional flatness that defined his crimes. His words expressed regret only in abstract terms. He spoke about consequences, not victims, about outcomes, not lives. The absence of true remorse was unmistakable. In confinement, he was removed from society, but not from himself. The fantasy that drove him to murder evaporated the moment reality closed in. There was no new life waiting, no freedom, no admiration, only isolation and the permanent knowledge of what he had done. Yet even then, his reflections remained self-centered, focused more on loss of opportunity than loss of life. The enduring impact of the Watts case lies in its psychological clarity. It reveals how danger can grow in silence, how emotional avoidance can become destructive, how the refusal to confront discomfort can lead to catastrophic decisions. Chris Watts did not lack intelligence. He lacked courage, and that absence proved deadly. This story continues to resonate because it forces an uncomfortable examination of normalcy. It reminds us that violence does not always announce itself through chaos or cruelty. Sometimes it arrives quietly, behind polite smiles and calm voices, waiting for the moment when escape feels easier than truth. The Watts family no longer exists, not because of fate or accident, but because one man chose himself over everyone else. That choice, once made, could never be undone. And the silence that followed is the only legacy he left behind. As time passed, the case did not fade. It deepened. Each retelling exposed another layer of how thoroughly Chris Watts had dismantled his own humanity. In interviews conducted after his conviction, he spoke with the same measured calm that defined his public appearances before the murders. There was no visible collapse of identity, no moment where the weight of what he had done overtook him. Instead, there was distance, an emotional wall so complete that even confession sounded rehearsed. He spoke about the murders as events rather than choices, as actions rather than betrayals. This linguistic separation was not accidental. It was consistent with the psychological structure that allowed him to commit the crime in the first place. By removing himself emotionally from his actions, he preserved the illusion that he was still, somehow, a decent man who had simply made catastrophic mistakes. But mistakes are unplanned. What Chris Watts did was planned. In the controlled environment of prison, where there were no expectations to maintain appearances, one might expect truth to surface. Instead, what emerged was something colder. His reflections focused on consequences to himself, on the loss of freedom, on the future he no longer had access to. He acknowledged the deaths, but rarely engaged with their emotional reality. His wife and children remained abstractions even in memory. This emotional vacancy is what distinguishes him from crimes driven by impulsive rage. There was no moment of release, No explosion followed by regret. There was only removal, a deliberate clearing of obstacles between him and the life he imagined. That life, of course, was never real. It was a projection built on denial and fantasy, sustained only because he refused to confront reality honestly. The affair that fueled his fantasy collapsed immediately after his arrest. The admiration he sought vanished the moment the truth emerged. There was no one waiting for him, no escape, no alternate future. The cost of his actions became absolute, but even then, his responses remained muted. Regret appeared intellectual rather than emotional, a recognition of loss without comprehension of pain. For those who study cases like this, the Watts murders represent a particularly unsettling pattern, not explosive violence, not long-standing criminal behavior, but emotional avoidance taken to its extreme conclusion. A man who never learned to say no, never learned to argue, never learned to accept being disliked. When forced to choose between discomfort and destruction, he chose destruction. The aftermath left an irreversible void. Shanann's voice, once so present online, vanished abruptly. Her children's laughter was reduced to recordings. Their lives were cut not by accident or illness, but by a person they trusted more than anyone else. The permanence of that betrayal is what continues to haunt those who encounter this case. There was no larger ideology behind the crime, no financial gain, no external coercion, only a desire to escape responsibility. That simplicity is what makes the case so disturbing. It removes distance. It forces the recognition that extreme violence does not always stem from extreme circumstances. Sometimes it grows quietly in ordinary lives. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life confined, not as a misunderstood figure or a tragic antihero, but as what he is. A man who chose himself over the lives of his family, a man who erased those closest to him rather than face the consequences of honesty. A man whose calm exterior concealed a capacity for absolute betrayal. There is no resolution to this story, no redemption arc, no lesson that softens its impact. Only the reality that the most dangerous decisions are sometimes made not in anger, but in silence. And once made, they cannot be undone. In the years following the murders, the fascination with the case did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. People searched for meaning where there was none. They replayed footage of Chris Watts on television, analyzing every blink, every pause, every unnatural smile. They dissected his words, his posture, his tone, hoping to find the moment where the mask slipped. But the truth was more unsettling. The mask never slipped because it was never a mask at all. It was emptiness. Chris Watts did not present as evil because he did not experience himself as evil. He experienced himself as inconvenienced, trapped, pressured. In his internal world, the needs of others were background noise. His own discomfort was central. This imbalance allowed him to justify the unjustifiable. It allowed him to see annihilation as problem-solving. What stands out most in retrospective analysis is how little emotional language he used when discussing his family. Even before the murders, his references to his wife and children were mechanical. He spoke of duties, schedules, routines, rarely of connection, rarely of affection that went beyond surface-level description. This emotional poverty did not appear overnight. It was cultivated through years of avoidance. Shanann Watts, by contrast, was emotionally expressive to the point of vulnerability. She confronted conflict directly. She communicated fear, hope, and frustration openly. She believed that problems could be addressed through honesty. That belief assumed the other person was capable of meeting her emotionally. Chris was not. When she sensed him pulling away, she did what many people do. She leaned in. She asked questions. She demanded reassurance. Each attempt to reconnect only deepened his sense of being cornered, not because she was wrong to ask, but because he lacked the internal capacity to respond. Rather than admitting that incapacity, he chose to eliminate the source of discomfort. This is where the psychology becomes especially chilling. Chris Watts did not view himself as choosing violence. He viewed himself as choosing relief. Relief from confrontation. Relief from responsibility. Relief from being seen as inadequate. Murder was not the goal. It was the means. The children, in his distorted reasoning, were collateral, not individuals with futures, but attachments to a life he wanted erased. This reduction of human beings into symbols is a hallmark of extreme emotional detachment. It is what allows acts that defy basic human instinct. After the case concluded, there were no revelations that reframed the narrative, no hidden abuse, no secret trauma that explained everything. There was only the banality of selfishness taken to its furthest extreme. That banality is what continues to disturb people. It offers no distance. It suggests that such acts are not reserved for monsters in the traditional sense, but for ordinary individuals who refuse to face themselves. Chris Watts has attempted, at times, to articulate remorse. But his language remains centered on outcomes rather than impact. He speaks of what happened, not of who was lost. He acknowledges facts without engaging with their emotional weight. This is not redemption. It is resignation. For the families left behind, there is no closure. There is only absence. Birthdays that no longer occur. Futures that were never lived. The knowledge that the person responsible was someone once welcomed into their lives. That proximity to evil is difficult to reconcile. The broader lesson of the Watts case is not about detecting hidden killers. It is about recognizing the danger of emotional suppression, of prioritizing comfort over truth, of believing that avoidance is harmless. When conflict is never addressed, it does not disappear. It transforms. Chris Watts did not suddenly become someone else. He became exactly who he had always been, stripped of pretense. A man who chose silence over honesty, fantasy over reality, and himself over everyone else. What continues to unsettle those who study this case is how completely Chris Watts severed himself from consequence in the moment of decision. There was no visible internal struggle that he later described. No moment where he claimed doubt overcame him. His recollections suggest a mind already closed, already resolved, already committed to a single outcome. This is not the psychology of someone overwhelmed by emotion. It is the psychology of someone who has emotionally evacuated. In the weeks before the murders, the contrast between appearance and reality sharpened. On the surface, life continued as usual. Work schedules were maintained. Conversations were polite. Routine masked rupture. Beneath that surface, however, Chris Watts had already disengaged from the moral framework that binds most people. The idea of causing irreversible harm no longer triggered resistance. It triggered calculation. This is a critical point. Many people experience resentment, dissatisfaction, even fantasies of escape. Very few act on them in destructive ways. The difference lies in accountability. Chris Watts did not hold himself accountable internally. He outsourced responsibility to circumstance, to pressure, to the existence of others. When accountability disappears, anything can be justified. The day the truth became unavoidable marked not a moral awakening, but an administrative end. Confession did not arrive as catharsis. It arrived as procedure. When denial failed, admission followed. When admission failed to soften consequences, acceptance followed. At no point did empathy lead the process. Efficiency did. Observers often ask whether he feels guilt. The more accurate question is whether he understands loss. Guilt requires recognition of another's pain as real and significant. Chris Watts's language suggests comprehension of outcome without comprehension of suffering. He knows what happened. He does not appear to feel it. This distinction matters because it explains why remorse, as commonly understood, remains absent. Remorse is not regret over consequences. It is grief for harm inflicted. In this case, grief never fully materializes. The emotional center remains fixed on the self. The cultural fixation on this case reveals something broader about collective fear. People are not only horrified by what happened, they are horrified by how little warning preceded it. No dramatic escalation, no public breakdown, no visible transformation, just a quiet man making an irreversible choice. That quietness is what lingers. It forces a reconsideration of how danger is identified. It challenges the assumption that violence announces itself loudly. It demonstrates that passivity and compliance can coexist with extreme harm. That politeness can mask indifference. That calm can conceal annihilation. For those left to carry memory forward, there is only the task of remembering the victims as more than elements of a crime. Shanann Watts was not a problem to be solved. She was a person with agency, fear, hope, and determination. Bella and Celeste were not extensions of adult conflict. They were children with trust, curiosity, and futures that were stolen. The reduction of their lives into a narrative of motive and method risks, repeating the very erasure that defined the crime. To remember them accurately is to resist that reduction. To acknowledge that what was lost cannot be quantified or resolved through explanation. Chris Watts remains in many ways unchanged. Time has not transformed him. Reflection has not reshaped him. The absence that enabled his actions persists. And that persistence is perhaps the most sobering aspect of all. There is no dramatic end to this story, no final insight that restores balance. There is only the enduring truth that some people do not confront their inner void until it consumes everything around them. And when that happens, the damage is permanent. As the years pass, the silence around Chris Watts grows heavier, not lighter. Silence is what defined him long before the murders, and it is what defines his existence now. In that silence, there is no confrontation with grief, no reckoning that reshapes identity. There is only repetition, the same thoughts circling endlessly, the same self-centered framing, the same emotional vacancy that made destruction possible in the first place. What is striking is how little his internal narrative appears to have evolved. When he speaks about the past, he frames it as a series of events that happened, not as lives that were taken. He acknowledges actions without absorbing meaning. This detachment is not a defense mechanism developed after the fact. It is the foundation on which the crime was built. Chris Watts did not lack awareness. He understood social rules. He understood consequences. He understood right and wrong in an abstract sense. What he lacked was emotional integration, the ability to feel responsibility as something internal rather than imposed. Without that integration, morality becomes conditional. It becomes something to perform rather than something to live. This distinction explains why he could perform grief convincingly enough to delay suspicion, yet fail to experience it authentically. Performance had always been enough. Throughout his life, compliance substituted for connection. Agreement substituted for honesty. And silence substituted for truth. In the broader context of family annihilation cases, this pattern appears again and again. The offender is often not outwardly violent. He is compliant, withdrawn, conflict avoidant. He does not assert himself. He erases himself, and when erasure becomes intolerable, he chooses to erase others instead. Shanann Watts represented confrontation. She represented visibility. She represented the demand that reality be acknowledged and addressed. For someone like Chris Watts, that demand felt unbearable, not because it was unreasonable, but because it required a self he never developed. The tragedy lies not only in the violence, but in the years that preceded it. Years in which honesty could have altered the outcome. Years in which discomfort could have been endured. Years in which responsibility could have been accepted. None of those years guaranteed happiness, but all of them preserved life. Instead, avoidance was chosen repeatedly until avoidance required annihilation to maintain itself. Public discourse often asks whether this case offers warning signs. The uncomfortable answer is that the warning signs were subtle because the danger was internal. Emotional absence does not announce itself. It does not raise alarms. It blends into social expectations of calm, politeness, and restraint. In many contexts, those traits are praised. This is why the Watts case continues to unsettle. It disrupts assumptions about what danger looks like. It forces recognition that emotional disengagement can be as destructive as overt aggression. That a lack of conflict is not the same as harmony. That silence is not safety. The lives that were lost cannot be restored through analysis. Understanding does not undo damage. But understanding does matter, because it reframes how such tragedies are perceived. Not as incomprehensible acts by inhuman monsters, but as the extreme outcome of human failures left unaddressed. Chris Watts will remain confined, physically separated from society, but emotionally unchanged. His story does not evolve toward insight or redemption. It stagnates, and in that stagnation lies its final warning. When a person refuses to confront truth, to tolerate discomfort, to accept responsibility, the cost does not remain internal. It spreads outward. The Watts family is gone because one man chose escape over honesty. That choice was made quietly, deliberately, and without remorse. And it stands as a stark reminder that the most catastrophic decisions are often made not in moments of chaos, but in moments of calm. Even now, the case resists closure because it offers no emotional resolution. There is no turning point where understanding softens the horror. There is no explanation that makes the outcome feel inevitable or justified. What remains is a void where empathy should have been, and that void is what ultimately consumed everything around it. Chris Watts did not grow into violence through a series of visible escalations. He grew into it through absence. Absence of confrontation. Absence of self-reflection. Absence of emotional honesty. Each avoided conversation strengthened the belief that escape was preferable to accountability. Each unspoken resentment deepened the divide between appearance and reality. By the time he acted, the people closest to him were already emotionally distant in his mind. The public often focuses on the moment of the crime, but the true beginning lies much earlier. It lies in the years of quiet compliance that masked internal dissatisfaction. It lies in the learned behavior of saying yes while meaning no, of presenting calm while feeling trapped, of believing that discomfort was something to be avoided rather than endured. This pattern is not rare. What is rare is its extreme conclusion. Most people eventually confront their dissatisfaction. They argue. They leave. They fail publicly. Chris Watts refused all of that. He wanted transformation without disruption, freedom without consequence, a new life without the burden of ending the old one responsibly. That desire shaped every decision he made. It shaped how he viewed his wife not as a partner, but as an obstacle. How he viewed his children not as lives to protect, but as attachments he could not carry into his imagined future. This mental reframing did not happen in a single moment. It developed gradually, quietly, until it became complete. After the murders, the world expected some form of reckoning, a breakdown, a flood of emotion, a visible collapse of the self. Instead, there was procedural compliance, admissions without depth, statements without weight. The absence of visible suffering was not strength. It was emptiness made visible. For those who continue to study the case, this emptiness is the most disturbing element. It suggests a form of moral disengagement so complete that even consequence fails to restore connection. Prison confines the body, but it cannot create empathy where none exists. It cannot rebuild an internal framework that was never fully formed. The victims, meanwhile, are remembered through fragments. Videos, photos, messages, moments frozen in time. Shanann's voice remains in recordings filled with hope and urgency. Bella and Celeste live on through brief glimpses of laughter and trust. These fragments are painful precisely because they are so ordinary. They represent lives in motion, abruptly stopped. The contrast between that vibrancy and the silence that followed underscores the scale of the loss. This was not a family defined by tragedy until it was ended by one. The violence did not emerge from chaos. It invaded normalcy and destroyed it from within. Chris Watts's story does not transform with retelling. It does not reveal hidden layers of complexity that redeem or excuse. Each examination leads back to the same core truth. A man chose himself, repeatedly, decisively, and without remorse. That choice remains the axis around which everything else turns. It explains the calm before the crime, the detachment during it, the emptiness after it, and the enduring discomfort it creates for anyone who confronts the reality of what happened. There is no moral distance to retreat to, no way to categorize this as an anomaly without confronting its implications. The Watts case endures because it forces a recognition that destruction does not always come from rage or hatred. Sometimes it comes from indifference, from the refusal to engage emotionally with the lives of others. The story of Chris Watts does not end with understanding, because understanding offers no comfort here. There is no explanation that restores balance, no insight that lessens the weight of what was done. What remains is a stark and irreversible truth. A family was erased not by fate, not by circumstance, not by uncontrollable rage, but by a man who chose himself over everyone else. Chris Watts was not driven by love, hatred, or desperation in the way people often imagine. He was driven by avoidance, by the refusal to face discomfort, by the belief that his own desire for escape mattered more than the lives bound to him. In the end, that belief consumed everything. Shanann Watts was a woman who believed in confronting problems, in fighting for her family, in honesty, even when it was painful. Bella and Celeste were children who trusted completely, who had no understanding of betrayal, no awareness of danger. Their lives were not lost in chaos. They were taken quietly, deliberately, by the person who should have protected them above all else. There is no redemption in this case, no hidden lesson that makes the outcome feel purposeful. The only legacy left behind is absence, empty rooms, silenced voices, futures that will never unfold, and a permanent reminder that normal appearances can conceal profound moral collapse. Chris Watts will live out his life confined, stripped of the freedom he sought, carrying the knowledge of what he destroyed. But his punishment does not restore what was lost. It does not bring meaning to the destruction. It only marks the end of his choices. This case endures because it forces an uncomfortable reckoning. Evil does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives quietly, behind polite smiles and calm words. Sometimes it grows in silence, in avoidance, in the steady erosion of responsibility. And when that silence finally breaks, it leaves nothing behind but irreversible loss.